Well, I'm getting ready to watch a video.
Really? What?
Oh, just some scary movie.
Would you believe it if I told you that this film was nominated for Worst Director at the Razzies in 1980? Yes, you heard that right. Stanley Kubrick was nominated for Worst Director with his film The Shining, a cultural milestone and nowadays considered one of the greatest films of all time. While I don't know what crack the critics were smoking to say this, it may have had something to do with the fact that it's a horror movie. Since the earliest days of cinema, one of the longest lasting genres has been horror, forever remaining with the cultural zeitgeist and earning the respect and adoration from casual filmgoers to devoted fanatics. Or at least, partially. While horror has indeed cemented itself as a mainstay within the art of film, it cannot be denied that society has not returned the favour. Horror is often one of the most, if not the most overlooked genre when it comes to discussions about the art of cinema, being instead regarded as little more than cheap entertainment or thrill with no actual substance or quality. It therefore seems like horror is destined to forever live in the realms of the cult film, the offshoot from the mainstream, the black sheep of Hollywood. Horror has however survived despite this unfair treatment, and this is largely due to an almost cult-like adoration from fans and enjoyers alike, appreciating and worshipping the genre and the things it presents and aims to say, in spite of how it is seen by the mainstream. And so, without further ado, allow me to take you on a journey through the discrimination, endurance, and survival of the twisted, macabre world of the most overlooked genre in film, the horror movie.
Scary movies?
Uh-huh.
What's your favorite scary movie?
Before I begin, it is obvious to say that not all horror falls under this category of ignored. Some of the most respected and influential directors of all time have been involved in the horror genre. I mean, look no further than Alfred Hitchcock. Horror has certainly had an occasional space in the spotlight as a respected genre. Hitchcock's 1961 Psycho is undeniably a horror film and is regarded as one of the greatest films of all time. Films like Lois Weber's Suspense and Murnau's Nosferatu were pioneers in the early days of film, and Robert Wien's Cabinet of Dr. Caligari influenced the German Expressionist movement, one of the most defining movements in film. However, horror has seemingly never been able to earn respect that all other genres in film get, a true appreciation and admiration as an art form. Horror has remained in the realm of the B-movie despite cementing itself as one of the most iconic and persistent genres in film. Horror is usually regarded as belonging to the realms of paracinema, a term created by historian Jeffrey Sconce. It discusses films that don't necessarily fit the demands of what Hollywood or the film industry wants. Films that exist as pure entertainment with nothing of actual value or substance, cheap thrills if you will. Think of some of your favourite horror films and at least one of them will be regarded as a cult film and therefore an example of paracinema. Horror is so often seen this way, as a genre devoted to nothing but delivering these cheap thrills which don't aim to provoke deep analysis or explore high concepts. Which is obviously very accurate, as horror has never ever explored deep philosophical or socially relevant ideas. Which ultimately begs the question, why is this genre so overlooked? Is it simply the presentation of the taboo that makes people disregard it as something that exists only to frighten and upset you? Horror, I'd argue, has offered some of the most effective and powerful examinations of the human psyche out of every genre. When the primary goal is to create fear, the sky is the limit. I mean, try listing everything humans are afraid of or everything that unsettles and disturbs us. You can't. The horror film has had a long and bountiful history exploring themes regarding the human condition, alienation, sexuality, legality, immorality, ambition, greed, hubris, even socially relevant topics like discrimination, class and prejudice. Hell, good versus evil as we understand it in the modern fiction arguably wouldn't exist without a little ditty called Dracula. But no, horror movies have only existed ever to provide cheap thrills and gore. Consider a cult classic like Saw. Described by literally everyone on the internet as torture porn, gross, the first Saw movie features hardly any gore and is instead a psychological horror asking you how far you'd be willing to go to live. What would you do? Dismember yourself? Permanently disfigure yourself? Murder someone? What kind of life do you have afterwards if you decide to go through these acts? These are some pretty dark and powerful questions that something which is regarded as little more than a gore fest by pop culture seems to ask. While horror's main appeal does likely come from its presentation of taboo content, and as argued by author Stephen Hanke, the reason why horror grew to such a cultural success, it is also likely why horror films have never reached the appreciation they deserve. Horror is, by its very nature, a deviation of what is expected, a love of the unlovable, a hard sell for those who get squeamish at the mere sight of blood.
Nightmare on Elm Street.
Is that the one where the guy had knives for fingers?
Yeah, Freddy Krueger.
Despite hardly any respect of horror films as an art form like so many other genres, horror has cemented itself within pop culture and absolutely reached the mainstream. It's not a stretch to say that horror movies have produced some of the most recognizable characters in pop culture, from Dracula to Frankenstein's monster, Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees, and the iconography associated with horror that most people have seen somewhere at least once. I mean, try finding someone who hasn't seen a ghost face mask or isn't at least vaguely aware of the psycho violin screech. So how is it that a genre that seems to have all the cards stacked against it, that seems to get no love from the Academy or from Hollywood, managed to infuse itself with pop culture to where elements are instantly recognizable? How indeed. Fandom is a tricky thing to define. Matt Hills, a researcher into fan culture, himself struggles with the definition. The general consensus is that fandom means different things for different people, depending on the focus of the fandom in question. Broadly speaking, a fan is someone who not only enjoys something, but allows that something to remain socially relevant. Adaptation, as academic Will Brooker explains, is what gives something a lasting legacy, and that adaptation can only happen when fans give that something the necessary power to survive.
Wow, well the first one was, but the rest suck.
There are 9 Nightmare on Elm Street films, 9 Texas Chainsaw Massacre films, 13 Halloween films, 10 Saw films, annoyingly only 12 Friday the 13th films, and over 200 Dracula films. The thing is, most of these films aren't that good, and yet they keep being made, and the characters and iconography imprinted itself on pop culture. Why? Well, it's obvious, isn't it? The fandoms. Be it fans of horror or fans of a particular character, fans are what kept the horror genre alive. Even in the 1950s, when the brunt force of the Hays Code was in full swing, horror continued because of the people, fans, going to the cinema to watch horror movies. Some of the most iconic names in horror film history were originally horror movie fans, like John Carpenter, who felt inspired by what they saw, by the gruesome visuals and dark narratives, and sought to recreate that themselves. In 2009, after more than 15 years in development, Freddy vs. Jason was released, a long-awaited crossover between the two horror icons of the 80s. The film, while not being the best thing ever made, only existed because the fans made it so, pushing for its release, attending conventions and pestering studios to have the film be made. If that doesn't show horror fan dedication, I don't know what will. Horror movies, whenever they're released, often, if not always, make a lot of money, box office successes even when the films are awful. The general public yearn to be scared, and while I won't go into why here, because quite frankly it would take an extra 10 videos, horror movies grant this. In this regard, everyone who goes to see a horror film, because it's a horror film, is part of the horror fandom. You wanted to go see the new shitty Possession ghost movie or derivative remake? Congratulations, you're keeping the horror genre alive.
What's your favorite scary movie?
Oh, come on, you know I don't watch that shit.
Why not?
I suppose this leaves one thread hanging. If horror is so connected to fan response, can it ever actually earn recognition? Or will this recognition erase any true art that horror contains, what with the mainstream tainting everything it touches? Consider the explosion of horror movies since the 2000s that have been panned by critics and fans alike. Unnecessary remakes, high-budget ghost stories and found footage movies, films that arguably break the niche and appeal to the mainstream, which inevitably results in the movie being worse, although of course there are exceptions. The 2014 horror The Babadook was poorly marketed as a mainstream horror movie featuring a scary monster, and when it turned out to be a psychological drama about her mother's relationship to her son, the reviews from fans were brutal, although fortunately in recent years it has become a cult classic and garnered the praise it deserves. Horror, however, does seem to be breaking this association with being nothing but cheap thrills. A genre steadily on the rise has been the pretentiously named elevated horror, or art house horror if you're a Letterboxd user. Fronted by visionary auteurs like Jordan Peele and Robert Eggers, this new genre has been receiving both critical and commercial acclaim, alongside praise from most audiences who admire and appreciate the more serious and thought-provoking tones that films like Get Out and The Witch take. Although, is this really a good thing? Is critical acclaim really something that matters? Moreover, are audiences going to pay attention to this more profound direction horror is going in, after being conditioned by societal expectations of jump scares and screams? So, true story, but when I went to see the new Nosferatu remake, I got the impression that a lot of the audience, in the least pretentious way, just didn't get it, laughing at scenes I found horrifying and profound. And it made me think, with the genre so rooted in a dependency on fan reception, is it good to take this elevated approach, to deliberately break out of the cheap thrills association it has been given? I would say yes and no. As long as horror movies make money, horror will survive, and we are entering an age where horror movies are rising in terms of critical reception. Hell, Demi Moore is predicted to win Best Actress at the Oscars for her role in body horror film The Substance, which, if you know anything about horror movies and the Academy, is just something that never happens. And if she does win, which she absolutely should, it will likely change the landscape of the entire genre. Horror is not going anywhere. If it survived the Hays Code, it can survive anything. It is the fandom that has kept it alive, be it huge circles of fans who devotedly worship horror icons, or the average person who just wants to see a scary movie. And we are entering an age where horror is being praised more and more, but ironically, as proven with the public reception of films like Nosferatu, there will always be that little niche audience of horror movies, whether they're art house or schlock. Ultimately, horror will survive, and will continue to give thought-provoking stories with beautiful, well-crafted visuals alongside generic popcorn entertainment. Whether or not they're successful, the film, and therefore the genre, will continue to live on, and it is all thanks to the fans, to the people who continue to see horror films despite their status as the black sheep of Hollywood.